In this lesson, we will review some of the rules for using commas. Before you begin, if you are unsure about the definition of an independent clause and a dependent clause, please go back and review the lesson on semicolons where it discusses about how to tell an independent clause from a dependent clause before you go on and listen to this lesson. In the lesson on semicolons, we learned that when you have two independent clauses together in the same sentence, generally they are linked with a semicolon. We have the first independent clause, semicolon, second independent clause. One exception to that is when the two independent clauses are linked with what's called a coordinating conjunction. And conjunctions are words such as and, but, or, so. Those little words. And it joins the two independent clauses, the conjunction does, in the sentence. I think it'll make more sense if we see an example. So in this example it says, I went to Topsham Fair and I rode the Ferris wheel. Well, let's think about this without the conjunction first. If we saw, I went to Topsham Fair, I rode the Ferris wheel, having learned our semicolons lesson, we would understand immediately that I went to Topsham Fair is an independent clause. I rode the Ferris wheel, an independent clause. Therefore, you would need a semicolon between the two. Thing is, here's that pesky little conjunction, and. That changes things. When one independent clause is linked to another independent clause by the use of a conjunction, you put a comma after the first independent clause. I went to Topsham Fair and I rode the Ferris wheel. If the second clause were dependent, not independent. If we make it rode the Ferris wheel, well, that's obviously a dependent clause. It couldn't be a complete sentence on its own. You do not use any punctuation within the sentence. I went to Topsham Fair and rode the Ferris wheel. Period at the end. That's it. No comma, no semicolon. Another time that we use commas is when a dependent clause starts a sentence, when a sentence begins with a dependent clause. So, for example, after I watered the flowers, the rain began. Well, there are two clauses here. The second one, the rain began, that's an independent clause. Very obviously an independent clause. But the first one, after I watered the flowers, is a dependent clause. It could not stand alone as a sentence. After I watered the flowers, what? Remember I said in the semicolon lesson, when you have a word like after, something's got to come, or if, something's got to come after. Right? If, after I watered the flowers, this happened. We need more to the sentence to make it an independent clause. Since that is the case, since it is a dependent clause, and it is introducing a sentence, it needs a comma after it. After I watered the flowers, the rain began. Now this is another instance where we can hear where the comma goes. We understand that's where the comma goes just by the way it sounds. Can't always depend on how it sounds, but often we can. Similarly to a dependent clause, if an adverb is used to introduce a sentence, there's a comma after the adverb as well. An adverb, you can often, not always, but often recognize an adverb, a word that modifies a verb, because it has ly at the end of it, right? He ran quickly. She grew slowly. Okay, that ly, the word modifies the verb. So in this instance, we see that the first word is finally, and it describes time-wise it modifies how you're able to get the computer working. So it is an adverb. That ly gives us a clue. Finally, I was able to get my computer working. So now we see that the adverb is at the beginning of the sentence, so it needs a comma. Finally, I was able to get my computer working. Now it gets a little more complicated from here. In this example, we have a negation. That means to negate something is to say it is not so, or to say it is this thing, not that thing. Right? So when you have a negation in the middle of a sentence, you set it off with commas. I saw a coyote, not a dog, cross the road. So you're making an assertion, I saw a coyote, and you're saying I saw a coyote cross the road. But in the middle of it, you have a negation. You want to make sure that people understand that you did not mistake a dog for a coyote. So you're saying it is a coyote, not, there's the negation, not a dog. So in that instance, that negation is set off with commas. I saw a coyote, not a dog, cross the road. Again, you can hear it. Here's where a natural pause comes. I saw a coyote, not a dog, cross the road. Now it's going to get a little more complicated, and bear with me because it'll kind of make sense by the time we get to the end. One of the ways you use commas is to set off what's called a non-essential appositive from the rest of the sentence. So I'm going to define an appositive and show you what the difference is between essential and non-essential. So to set a non-essential appositive off from the rest of the sentence. So an appositive is a noun or a phrase that somehow as it says here, explains, describes, identifies a noun that is right next to it. So if I say, my mother, Gloria Walter, is a teacher, I could say just, my mother is a teacher. That would be the basic sentence. But I decided to add her name for whatever reason. So I say, my mother, Gloria Walter, is a teacher. That Gloria Walter, that phrase, name, is an appositive. It identifies the noun right next to it. My mother, Gloria Walter, is a teacher. Okay. So there are times when that appositive, that word or phrase that gives you more information about the noun, is absolutely necessary or essential to the sentence. You can see that here. If someone came up to you in the hall and said, your professor wants you to stop by, you would probably have no idea which professor that person was talking about. It could be your philosophy professor, your English professor, your accounting professor, right? So in this sentence that says, your professor, Dr. Galgan, wants you to stop by, that appositive, Dr. Galgan, which gives you more information about professor, is absolutely essential to your understanding of the sentence. Therefore, when you're writing it, you do not set it off with commas. Your professor, Dr. Galgan, wants you to stop by. Absolutely essential to your understanding. Which professor? If, however, the person came up to you in the hall and said, Dr. Galgan, your professor, wants you to stop by, well, that's a non-essential appositive. If the person said to you just, Dr. Galgan wants you to stop by, you would know who it is who wants to see you. And that's all the essential information in the sentence. Dr. Galgan wants you to stop by. For some reason, this person needed to put in your professor, the appositive. That refers to me. Gives you more information. So Dr. Galgan, your professor, wants you to stop by. In this case, you do set the appositive off with commas. And you notice in these cases when it's a positives, and there'll be another thing later on when it's set off with commas. If something is in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of, has a few words before it and after, either a clause or an introductory phrase, when you set it off with commas, it's important that you remember that there's a comma before it and a comma after it. Very often, students will put the comma before the appositive, but not after the appositive. And that actually can be very confusing for a reader, because you get the comma, and even if you don't know what an appositive is called, you kind of know what it means. It's set off with a comma, it's giving me more information, but then it doesn't end with a comma, so you're kind of looking for the end. It gets very confusing. So make sure that you use a comma just before the appositive and just after the appositive. Okay. So here's an example. The author Stephen King is quite famous. Is that essential or non-essential? Think about it for just a second. Okay, we've got the noun, the author. You've got the appositive. Stephen King refers to the author, right? That's giving you more information. Is it essential? In this case, it is an essential appositive. Because if I said to you just the author is quite famous, your natural response would be, which author are you talking about? How do I know the author? So here, Stephen King as an appositive is essential. Here, we have the author of The Stand. Stephen King is quite famous. Is still again Stephen King. That's the appositive. Right? Refers back to the author of The Stand. Is it essential or non-essential? Think about it for a minute. In this case, it is non-essential. Because we have the title of the book, we know who the author is. If I said the author of The Stand is quite famous, without the appositive at all, the meaning of the sentence is clear. Pretty well-known book by Stephen King. People know he wrote it. You wouldn't need it there. So in this case, it needs to be set off with commas. Okay, now, another error that I see is, remember those coordinating conjunctions, and, but, for, whatever. Generally, a comma is not used after a coordinating conjunction. So, I had hoped to find a job and earn some extra money. Sometimes there are students who, for whatever reason, want to put a comma after the and or the but here. And generally, you don't do that. In a straightforward sentence like this, there should be no comma. I had hoped to find a job and earn some extra money. And you can hear there's a flow there, right? It makes sense. In this case, the second part of the sentence is a dependent clause. So, so there's no comma before the end. But there almost always should not be a comma after that coordinating conjunction. Unless, and here's the problem, a non-essential clause comes after a conjunction. Okay. This is not very common. So if you are in doubt, do not put the comma after the coordinating conjunction. It's less of a glaring error than it is if you put a comma after the conjunction and it shouldn't be there. So if in doubt, leave it out in this case. So, but I'll show you what I mean. Here, I hope to find a job and, of course, move to a new apartment. Right? Well, you don't really need that, of course, do you? I hope to find a job and move to a new apartment. So in that instance, there's the comma here, but you notice it's not just a single comma. It's a phrase that has to be set off with commas within the sentence. So another good way to tell whether you need that comma after and or not is if you want to put it in, find out where you'd put the second comma to set the phrase off. If you can't find a place, then it means you don't have a non-essential phrase there to be set off with commas. Now, I know this is all pretty confusing, that last part. It can be very confusing. So just make sure, if there's stuff you don't understand, that you email me either through Canvas or at wgalgan@sfc.edu.